Fossil fuels are forms of fuels made out of, you guessed it, fossils. Specifically, fossilized remains of plants and animals formed under the ground from millions of years ago. These fossil fuels are mined or extracted from our mountains and seabeds and then burned for power and electricity. The most common forms of fossil fuels are what we see every day: coal, oil, and gas. How did it begin? When did climate change begin? The discovery of coal actually fueled the Industrial Revolution. This is the photo that you're seeing here right now. It fast-tracked the making of iron, leading to a surge of economic activity. Because of coal, trains were built, factories were powered, products were shipped across borders. Coal was used to power electricity, and up until today, coal is still the most dominant form of fuel in our electricity mix, not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world. But how do we know that coal and fossil fuels really are the problem? This is a graph from NASA showing the immediate rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere beginning from the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Let's take a look at this graph. These are the years before today: 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, 800,000 to 1,000,000 years ago. Atmospheric carbon dioxide had never been above that line. Meanwhile, since the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric emissions have skyrocketed beyond belief, therefore causing this endless crisis. So today, how do we define climate change in the perspective of a vulnerable country? Climate change is a significant and long-lasting change in the Earth's climate and weather patterns, caused mainly by the burning of fossil fuels such as oil, gas, and coal. When we burn them, fossil fuels release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, such as methane, into the air, causing an enhanced greenhouse effect and making the planet heat up. And it is undeniable. Thousands of scientists all over the world have been saying the same thing. To prevent further loss and damage from the climate crisis, we must immediately and radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere by phasing out the use of fossil fuels and limiting global warming to only 1.5 degrees Celsius post-industrial revolution. Going beyond these numbers spell irreversible catastrophe, especially to vulnerable countries like ours. These are lifted from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is from a report from scientists all over the world saying we must stop the use of coal, oil, and gas now. Which brings us to this. How does that affect us? The Philippines, being a developing country, is among one of the least contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Yet it is ranked as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate impacts. This is not only because of our geographical situation. We are somehow at a geographical disadvantage. We are right beside the Pacific Ocean, which is a warm body of water and where storms and typhoons form. And the first landmass that it hits is the Philippines or other countries in Southeast Asia. We are also an archipelago, which means we have thousands and thousands of coastlines and coastal communities that are vulnerable to sea level rise, flash floods, and storm surges. Other than that, we are also ranked high in vulnerability, not just because of the geographical factor, but because of our socio-political and economic conditions. Our social, political, and economic conditions make it so that we cannot adapt to the worsening impacts of climate change. We all know what happens after typhoons. The nations barely reach affected communities. Climate-resilient infrastructure still does not exist. Disaster equipment is barely available in LGUs despite it being mandated. And a lot of our funding is focused on militarization instead of climate adaptation. Stories of storms and typhoons are dinner table conversations in a vulnerable country like ours. Droughts, El Nino, flash floods. This is what we are most familiar with and what we usually attribute to climate change. But that's not all it is it? I invite you to look at this picture. This photo is not from the Philippines. This is a photo from a farming community in Mozambique. What do you see? This is a photo of a child holding another child. Yes, that is a 13-year-old carrying her own child. This is from an article called Brides of the Sun. The article talks about a farming community in Mozambique seeing a rise of child brides just as the global temperatures were rising. When the sun became hotter and the weather became more unpredictable, harvests were more scarce. Marrying off one of the girls in your family was a way to ensure that they survived and was one less mouth to feed. This is what the climate crisis can also look like. I am pretty sure that we have more than enough cases like this in the Philippines as well, although maybe not yet documented. Can we imagine how else the crisis can look like for all of us as the climate worsens? They say that climate change is the great equalizer. Sabi nila, walang pinipili ang bagyo. Man or woman, young or old, rich or poor, lahat tayo nasasalanta. None of us are spared. But research says otherwise. Climate change impacts women and children disproportionately, making Filipino women and children the most vulnerable among an already vulnerable country. A study by Save the Children shows these numbers. Children born in 2020 in the Philippines will live through 4.9 times more scorching heat waves, 2.3 times more river floods, 1.2 times more droughts, and 1.5 times more crop failures than their grandparents or people born 60 years ago. This is going to get worse. That's what it means. Children in poorer communities will be worse affected as they are already at a far greater risk of battling waterborne diseases, hunger, and even facing death due to malnutrition, increased floods, and cyclones. We are commemorating the 10th year of Yolanda this month. Back then, I remember reading that those few who were able to survive Yolanda did not survive the evacuation centers because that's where they got waterborne diseases. That's where they got hungry. That's where the roofs fell on their sleeping heads. Climate impacts risk trapping millions more children into long-term poverty. And not just the climate crisis, but in other disasters, children make up to 50 to 60% of those affected. Just a few more things, zooming in on the impacts on women and girls. I cannot get into the nitty-gritties of this, but for a quick snapshot, women also face systematic violence that escalate during periods of instability. They have less access to basic resources, rights, education, and information. Women have less access to decision-making processes. We have all seen this. We have just gotten through the barangay election. What did the results look like? Were there many women in the roster? Rise of gender-based violence and exploitation as resources dwindle. More vulnerable to human trafficking and extreme labor exploitation, especially during desperate times. More women are forced to leave homes in cases of climate-related displacement. A lot of women in our country, whether we like it or not, are still not title holders in their own residences. In times of conflict, in times of desperation, they're usually the ones who have to be displaced. At hindi lang to gawa-gawa. This is actually recognized by the United Nations. In fact, the Paris Climate Agreement includes specific provisions to ensure women receive support to cope with the hazards of climate change. And so we say climate change is not the great equalizer. Climate change is a threat multiplier. Escalates already existing social, political, and economic tensions in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Women and children have already been vulnerable. This is what it means. And what climate change is doing is just exposing those vulnerabilities. But of course, I am not here to just be a bearer of bad news. Kahit ang bigat na. Women and children and youth from communities are actually at the front lines of the struggle. I'm glad to tell you that our generation will not just sit by and idly accept this future. Our community is proof that we are not just mere victims of this crisis. We, the women, the children, and the vulnerable, are also at the front lines of shaping the future, a future where fossil fuels become nothing but history. The photos that you see here date back to 1997. This is a photo from our community in Negros Occidental. The woman that you see on the right is Doc Romana de los Reyes, who started to organize against a coal-fired power plant in her hometown in Bago City in Negros. Later, the proponent of the coal plant moved from Bago to Silay to Pulupandan, where the fight lasted until the year 2001. Beside Doc Romana is Tita Ella, who led the fight in Pulupandan until victory. Meanwhile, the photo on the left is highly symbolic of our movement. It is a photo of a mother attending a lightning strike against coal, sandwiched between her duties as a homemaker. Between cooking breakfast and lunch and sending her children to school, there she is, fighting for the future of her children on the streets. These women you see in these photos, together with the youth, the church, workers, and other basic sectors, led the fight against coal to victory. Because of them and the community that came together, there is no single coal-fired power plant in the island of Negros Occidental. But of course, the story continues. In 2001, after thwarting all the attempts of coal proponents, the province of Negros Occidental thought that the fight ended there. But it didn't. There was another proponent that went in 2012 in Cadiz, and they resisted it. And in 2018, our generation faced our own battle against coal. This corporation proposed a coal plant to be constructed in San Carlos City, one of the greenest and cleanest cities in the entire world. Together with our fellow youth, the students, the church, the workers, and women, we organized discussions in our communities, wrote letters to our leaders, sat down with the decision makers, and took the fight to the streets. In the middle of our campaign is only when we learned the story of Doc Romana and our history against fossil fuel resistance. On March 6, 2019, after months and months of organizing and lobbying, we gathered 2,000 student strikers in front of the provincial capital, and the governor greeted us with a signed copy of the executive order declaring Negros coal-free. On that day, Doc Romana de los Reyes stood with us, just like she did when she started alone 26 years ago in 1997. Beside her is Bishop Jerry Almenaza, one of the staunchest advocates for renewable energy, who gave our campaign direction and heart. This photo is a testament to the intergenerational, multi-sectoral struggle that is necessary to win against something as big as the fossil fuel industry. This photo is a community of dreamers. The next thing we asked ourselves after we had that monumental victory was, where do we go next? Don't stories usually end right here after a happy ending? There was no storybook or guidebook that told us what happens afterwards. On the day we won a victory, we weren't even able to write a statement or a press release. We looked at each other as if to ask, what kind of world do we build after this? But we were young people who knew and saw what power could look like when we came together, and so we became restless. We learned that our fight against coal was not about passing an executive order. It was about realizing that we can shape our future if we come together. We found ourselves lending our time to causes of human rights, healthcare, education, food sovereignty, gender justice, and more. This is where we saw other young people who looked a lot like us, and more importantly, cared a lot like us. And we knew that hope was still alive and that a better future was possible. Fighting for climate justice can seem complex and intimidating. After all, it's not as simple as swapping out plastic straws for paper straws, right? It is critically interconnected with everything else that having only one solution for it seems impossible. But the solution is already there. The climate crisis is so interconnected with other struggles that all we have to do is weave the justice work that we do together. Climate justice means gender justice, means access to education, means healthcare, means continuous resistance against systemic oppression. This is what the climate crisis asks of us, to imagine a better world and break apart the idea of the world as we know it, a world barely surviving under a capitalist system that is built on the backs of our oppression, exploitation of environmental resources, and unpaid labor. A world where millions are starving while food is thrown out and destroyed. A world where farmers come home empty-handed while the month's worth of harvests rot before getting to market. A world where we continue to burn fossil fuels, the root cause of the climate crisis, as it continues to disrupt the fabric of our society, destroy economies, and dismiss our lives as collateral damage. They say it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I echo and honor my ancestors by saying, let us imagine the end of capitalism. If we break apart the existing ideas of how the world should work, we will be able to see that the solutions are already taking root in the intersections of our struggles. Care work is justice work. Conservation is justice work. Gender equality is justice work. Climate justice is justice work. And it is already here. Thank you very much.